Hey everyone, what's up? This is Uri Peleg for Upswing Poker, and in this video I'm going to be reviewing a high-stakes hand played between Doug Polk and Dan Smith, in which Doug sets a trap but doesn't get exactly the run out he expected, and things get kind of dicey. But first, I'm really excited to share with you guys that I have a new Upswing course coming out at the end of next month. Modern poker courses are very focused on math and solvers, and while these things do help to develop a solid approach to poker, once that approach is developed, they can be discarded. The poker I teach in this course allows for a lot of freedom, but it also lets you take away the core theoretical concepts I had to learn through thousands of hours of solver study without ever having to look at a solver yourself. We'll walk through some of the most important ways to improve your game in a way that's easy to implement and easy to digest, no matter what level you're at. So let's get into the hand. This game is 100-200 with a $200 ante, and you can see there's a $400 straddle by the pot size. It's folded to Dan Smith on a button. He opens Queen Jack off to 1100, and just to kind of pause and say, how deep are we? Always an important question. So if there's a straddle that's 400 and there's antes, and these two guys are roughly 400 to 500 big blinds deep, just for context. And that's really more important than the money amounts. Now, here Doug chooses to 3-bet with a7 suited, and Dan calls with Queen Jack off, both of which are fair enough plays. Queen Jack off should sometimes fold for sure. And now we see a flop, and this is where kind of the first point of evaluation happens in the hand, and we need to ask ourselves, how big of a pot does each player want, and what's he navigating to? What does he want to happen? And here, when we look at Doug's hand and we look at the amount of money behind, we're like, well, obviously he has a very strong hand. He wants a lot of money to go in. How would he be doing if all the money went in? And here the thing is, keep in mind how many runouts are there where all the money going in is good for you. Because let's say the turn is a king, queen, jack, 10, 9, 8, or heart. How do you feel about getting 20x the pot in here? And the answer is not so great. So Doug's hand, while it wants a bigger pot, it's going to have to reassess street by street. Certainly if the board goes deuce 3, his hand might actually be close to wanting all the money in. Close to it. Definitely wants a large amount of money in, but it really depends on the run out. Whereas Dan, his hand has 0 showdown value, but it's strong to the nuts. So he kind of, the pot's too big for his hand, we would say. So he could bluff at some point, and he has to keep in mind with his hand that given it might turn into the nuts, it has kind of a higher incentive to bluff than if he had just air. Of course, this board is more good for Doug than for Dan, so Doug's going to play his range more aggressively. And he starts out with a pot size c-bet, and what he's doing here is he's saying, okay, I'm now taking my hands that want to play for lots of money. And it's a question, how many of those hands are there? Can ace-king do this? Can ace-queen do this? Again, with all this money behind, and personally, I'm not completely sure at the stack depth that this is the most appropriate way to play a7 for the reasons I mentioned, or the most appropriate way to play ace-king. If Doug were 100 deep, certainly this is fine, maybe even 200 deep, but 400, I'm less sure. But yeah, he starts out with pot, which is certainly, going in the right direction for him, and denies a lot of equity from draws that Dan might have, and that he does have, and Dan should probably fold here quite often. Whenever you have a hand that should mostly fold, theory would say sometimes call, because then when you hit, they never put you on a draw kind of thing. But yeah, this is close. Let's say this is close, but probably a fold just because Doug bet so big. And, draws are also about pot odds. But yeah, Doug bets really big. We get the queen, and now Doug, like we said, on a lot of the deck, he has to reevaluate, and now his ace-7 is actually not aiming for such a big pot size anymore, because he's now losing to ace-queen, he's losing to king-jack. Any hand with 2 spades has a lot of equity against him, so any spade or any heart, he's going to have to slow down. If the river is a queen, it counterfeits his 2-pair, so there's all these bad things potentially going on. And if on the flop you could say, well, there's all these good runouts. Now we're in bad runout land. We have to reevaluate. And our beautiful hand that wanted all the money and now goes to being like, I want a bit more money and like I could put 20K in, and that's probably roughly it, like not more than that. And then there's always a question of how. Like, do you want to bet 20K right now and check the river and hope? Or do you want to check and let your opponent put the money in? Doug, in this instance, elects to check. How bad a card is the queen for him depends on how often Dan has king jack. And Doug bet pot on a flop. And this is where hand reading comes in. Because we're always thinking about the narrative of the hand and who the card is good or bad for. And part of the nice thing with Doug's big bet is that it's supposed to fold out draws, and then these cards are not so bad. And and then maybe you can barrel A7. So that's a nice thing with a big bet. But it looks like Doug doesn't think that, and certainly Dan doesn't think that. So that they're both kind of playing in line with what's going on. Now, Dan in this situation has a pair of queens. How big of a pot does a pair of queens want? Well, if it checks down, he's probably doing okay. This is, it's kind of appropriate pot size for him. I would say when Doug bets and then checks, a lot of his range, if you would imagine it, is, and this is really important hand reading stuff, is going to be hands that hit the queen. His checking range is like hands that hit the queen and some traps, let's say, or some give-ups. But king, queen, and queen jack are in there. So you chop with queen jack. It's not great, but it's part of the pot share. And then Dan would be, in theory, bluffing with his sevens, bluffing with his tens. But the queen's also a potential bluff because even though we're right around at the pot size, you're not doing so great with queen jack. So I wouldn't mind the bluff. I don't mind the check. We have the deuce of hearts river. This doesn't change a lot. It does mean that Dan can now have more flushes. Like we said, his queen jack, when checked down in this situation, will win a small amount of the pot. It did come out kind of a nice run out for him, so it's okay to consider bluffing. And if you do bluff, you need to think about the story that you're telling. So Dan chooses to fire 35,000, and what's the story that he's telling? Well, probably if he had two pairs set or straight, we'd have heard from him on the turn. So he's kind of saying, hey, Doug, I have a hand that's worth 35,000, but the flush is worth more than 35,000. So this is a bit of an odd bet. Is he saying I'm betting ace king for 35,000? Or I'm betting ace jack for 35,000 like I'm betting against your queen? That feels a bit too big. So there's something a bit odd about the 35,000 bet to me. And these things stand out, depending on how proficient the player is. Generally speaking, less proficient players don't have the thought process about the bet size. So it wouldn't necessarily be odd. They might overplay a hand or underplay a hand because they don't overbet. But Dan's a professional player, so this is a bit odd from him. And let's see, if we think about Doug, I guess we can go back to Doug's decision to check on the river. So his hand is worth a bet. Since it came a heart, maybe even a smaller bet, maybe like 10K. But there's always the question of what's the best way to get the money with your hand. Here it looks like Doug thinks that the best way is to check because it came consecutive good cards for Dan. And, maybe Dan's going to put the money in for him. The idea with ace7 as a hand strength is it stops Dan from betting ace king, ace jack, and those are the main hands he might have here in bet. So yeah, maybe he thinks he'll get more money from them by checking than by betting. I think it's a fair choice. Like when you're navigating to a pot size, you're out of position, you can get there by betting or checking. And you guys can see Doug kind of calling. He's not super happy about it. You kind of have to call because the dynamic of the situation is that you have a king, queen, and queen, jack, and you have some traps, and he's supposed to bet some hands that beat your queens, and a7 is a trap, so you don't fold a7. Now, had Dan went for a big overbet, now a7 is no longer really a trap. It's just as good as a queen, and maybe you deviate and you say, I'll actually call my queen with a heart and fold my a7. But with this size where it's not clear enough what exactly Dan is betting with a7 is kind of forced to call. And yeah, that's a hand, I think, generally speaking, well played by both players. You know, they both could have easily chosen different paths, but I think they both kind of correctly recognized roughly where their hands were going for. Dan did recognize that his hand was not worth very much despite being middle pair. Doug recognized how bad the board got for his a7, we'll say, very, very quickly. And I think even by Doug's face on the river, you can tell that he has to call, but it's not like, snap call, I beat you, I trapped you. It's like, you know, I hope you have the part of your range that I beat or a bluff and not the flushes. And it's worth wondering if Dan's bet size gives it away here. That's it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you want to pre-register for the Poker Blueprint, feel free to click on the link in the description below. We have 2 previous videos and there's going to be another one coming out next week. So hope you guys check them out and I will see you next time.